Welcome to week 4. This particular video session is going to be on the subject of psycholinguistics. And I always joke to my students that that would be a great name for a band. But we just finished talking about neurolinguistics, which is looking at how the brain handles languages. Psycholinguistics is a different kind of way of analyzing language. It's kind of looking at the psychology of how languages function within the brain. And it's really arguing how can we conceptualize languages, not the neurological aspect of it, but the psychological aspect of it. And Colin Baker's book presents many different types of models, and I just wanted to kind of go over them with you and share some anecdotal records as well with you in terms of what they might look like in the classroom. One of the first ones he talks about is the balloon theory. So this argument is that languages are kind of like balloons in our head, right? So here's my funny looking person here. And it's arguing that one language makes up one balloon, your first language, and a second language makes up the second balloon. And what we know today is that the balloon theory is a false theory. It's arguing that in order for you to increase your first language, you have to somehow decrease your second language. So it's looking at languages like balloons in the sense that one has to be deflated in order to inflate the other. And so therefore you could never really have two balloons inflated at the same time. It's arguing that your second language has to get deflated in order for you to learn your first, and vice versa, right? And we know today that languages don't function like balloons, that you don't have to deflate one for the sake of the other. But this is a very common misconception that you still hear about in schools as well as with politicians. So for example, the argument goes that, oh, if Samina needs to learn more English, what we need to do is have her stop speaking at home in Hindi and Urdu. The argument here is I must deflate the balloon that's responsible for my first language in order to increase or inflate the balloon for my second language, English. And we know today that that's quite false, that we can maintain multiple languages and that you don't necessarily have to deflate one to inflate the other. But it's pretty amazing to think of almost a couple of decades ago, pediatricians would often tell parents not to speak to their children in their native tongue so as not to confuse them and to increase the English language. So even doctors were telling parents wrong information. And we know a lot more about languages today. And the argument here is the balloon theory just does not work for bilingual education. Let's look at the next theory. The next theory is arguing that languages are kind of like icebergs. So it's arguing that there is the base of the iceberg, and the iceberg on the surface is very different from the base. So the iceberg theory, which was presented by Jim Cummins, argues the point that all of us have a central operating system, which forms our understanding of language as a whole. So for example, think about your own language acquisition. Growing up in your home, most of you probably picked up the phonology of a language, right? You understood the sounds within your language, you learned what sounds were available in your immediate environment, and eventually you start stringing sounds together to make words, and then eventually you start saying your first words. So all of us enter school knowing the phonology of our first language. And then eventually over time, as you go into school and as your schooling increases, you learn other aspects of language. So for example, you learn aspects of morphology, the argument of, for example, adding an ed for past tense or adding an s for plural. Those are all examples of morphology. As young children also gain understanding of morphology in their first language. So for example, many children might say, "Mommy, I eated the cookie." They don't know that eat is ate and it's an irregular past tense, But young children figure out at a young age that that ed morpheme must mean the past tense, and then start adding it to their verbs to indicate something that they did in the past, even though their parents did not actually grammatically teach that morpheme. We also learn syntax, learning to structure and put words together to make sentences. We also learn semantics, the argument that you have to make meaning and using certain words to convey certain kinds of meaning. And then we also learn pragmatics. That's the argument that you use language for the sake of power and using language for the sake of rhetoric as well. So think about your own schooling. Most of you began in your homes to pick up the phonological aspects of your first language, the sound systems and how sounds are strung together to make words. Also at home, you probably picked up on the morphology, when to add certain morphemes to indicate past tense, future tense, plural versus singular, in some cases gender as well. And eventually when you start entering kindergarten in school, you eventually pick up on sentence structure, syntax, eventually you pick up on semantics, how to make meaning through words, and then eventually by the time you get to high school and college, you learn pragmatics, how to use language for the sake of conveying power and argument. So throughout our lives, we develop these aspects of language and develop a central operating system. And that's the argument that all of us have to, at some point or another, understand how languages work and how they function. So let's say as a child, I'm growing up in India and I'm learning all of these South Asian languages. I'm learning the phonology, morphology, and then eventually when I entered kindergarten in India, I started to learn the syntax, semantics of the Hindi language. So therefore, I had developed a fairly strong central operating system in my native language, which is the first tip of that iceberg. So my native language had already a strong base, and I had already understood how languages work. Therefore, coming to know English later on in life, when I immigrated to the United States, I eventually learned English as my fourth or fifth language. And the argument here is because I had a strong foundation in language as a whole, I could learn that second language quite easily. This is also the argument for bilingual education. So for example, you might have a child who comes into your classroom and they might be from a rural part of Mexico. And what you might find is they might have an understanding of the phonology and the morphology of their first language, but they really have not developed a syntax, semantics, and pragmatic sense of that first language. And so therefore, if they don't have a very strong foundation in that first language, it is that much more challenging for them to acquire a second language. So I'll give you some examples from my own classroom teaching. When I began teaching, I was a bilingual teacher in Houston, Texas, and I was teaching at the 6th grade level. And I had two students my first year of teaching. One was Maria, and Maria had come from Oaxaca, a rural part of Mexico. She was from an agrarian family, and so therefore sometimes she didn't go to school and she was pulled out to work on the farm. She had a very itinerant education, highly mobile, wasn't always fully in school throughout her entire elementary years. And then when she came to the United States in the 6th grade, what I found was that she did not really have a strong foundation in the Spanish language. She was not really literate in her first language. On the other hand, I also had Jose, who came into my classroom, and he was from Matamoros, a much more urban center in Mexico, and he had gone to formal schooling from K all the way to 5th grade. He had attended the public schools, he had learned to read and write in Spanish. When he came into my classroom, he was reading all the time in Spanish and writing all the time. He had really developed a very strong central operating system. He understood phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and a bit of pragmatics in the Spanish language. And so therefore for him, learning English was that much more easier because he already had a very solid foundation in his first language. And so therefore, many of the ELL children in our classroom might be more like Maria, and some might be like Jose. It's very important for you as a teacher to figure out how strong is that central operating system, how strong of a foundation do they have in their first language, because that's going to greatly affect that second language. I also once had a student who came into my classroom from a rural part of Mexico who did not really speak Spanish as her first language. She spoke Nahuatl, which is an indigenous native language of Mexico. I made the assumption that because she was from Mexico, Spanish must have been her first language, and I was quite wrong. And so you might have children in your classroom who might be coming from Mexico, but their first language is not Spanish. It might actually be an indigenous Native American language. And so therefore, for many of them, Spanish might be a dialect, or they might know just enough Spanish to be able to function within their community. And then when they come to the United States, it's quite challenging to find bilingual teachers who speak Maya or Nahuatl, the native language within Mexico. And so therefore, those children are going to struggle greatly because they don't have that strong foundation in that first language. The next theory that Baker brings up is the threshold theory. The threshold theory argues that there are 3 thresholds, and they almost look like different levels of a building. And he talks about the lower, the middle, and the upper threshold. And in the image in your book, you also see ladders. And the argument is the ladders are there because language acquisition is a much more fluid process. It's arguing the point that bilinguals are constantly moving back and forth across these different thresholds. However, we all want to get to that upper threshold. So let's look at that lower threshold. The lower threshold is the bilingual student who comes into your classroom who is not really strong in their first language, let's say Spanish or Urdu or Arabic, and then therefore English is not that strong as well. These are the students who are most at risk in our classrooms in the sense that they come out of those elementary years of schooling not really strong in their native language and not really strong in the English language either. And they're the ones who are sometimes called semilingual. However, that is a very problematic term as well. And the argument here is that there isn't really great strengths in either, and so they really haven't developed that kind of solid foundation once again in either language. And people argue that there are negative consequences for children in our educational system who have a very weak understanding of both their native language and that second language. Eventually, though, students through their elementary schooling get to that middle threshold. And what that middle threshold means is that all of a sudden, one of the 2 languages becomes stronger and the other becomes slightly weaker. So for example, if the child is put into an ESL classroom, what might happen is that all of a sudden their English becomes really, really strong, and eventually their Spanish becomes weaker. So they're gaining academic achievement in the English language, but they're losing that first native language. And eventually that child might continue to take, for example, Spanish as a native speaker later on in middle school and high school, and might reach that upper level where they are now literate in both languages, both English and Spanish, and they can really think in both languages, and they can really increase their academic achievement in both languages. And that's the threshold we will eventually see our students reach. However, when you first have a student in your classroom in those initial years, they might be at that lower threshold. And eventually, over time, they're making their way up to that upper threshold. However, sometimes students get stuck at certain thresholds and they don't feel like they can move in that upper directions. And sometimes also students might regress and go back to that lower threshold as well, which is why the ladders are here on both sides to indicate that it's a much more fluid type of process. However, the reality is the majority of our children start off at the lower level and eventually over time get to that upper threshold. The last theory that's brought up in this chapter is the Bix and Kalb theory. And this is arguing that there is a difference between Bix, basic interpersonal communication, and Kalb, cognitive academic language proficiency. And it's arguing that the majority of ELL children who come into our classroom, eventually over a year or 2, they're going to learn to communicate in English. They can have conversations with us in English. They can understand what people are saying and respond to it. However, if I handed them a science textbook in English, that might be a much more challenging task for them to understand what that textbook is saying. So for example, when I began teaching in the 90s, oftentimes after a year or two, I would push my bilingual children into that mainstream classroom where now all of a sudden they have to be able to understand the grade level curriculum in the English language. And I found that many of them were struggling to be able to swim in that mainstream classroom. Eventually, No Child Left Behind passed, and it required all ELL children to be tested not only in terms of language proficiency, but also in terms of academic proficiency. And for the first time, ELL teachers were talking about teaching academic content to ELL children. For the most part, prior to that, many of us were teaching functional English or teaching English that allowed our ELL children to function within American society. So what Bix and Kalps is arguing is that we need to spend a lot more time focusing on the cognitive academic language proficiency piece, because eventually ELL children will pick up on the Bix. They'll eventually learn to communicate with each other in English, but that academic English can only be gained in a formal schooling setting. So it's looking at the idea of having cognitively undemanding tasks and then cognitively demanding tasks. It's looking at context embedded versus a lack of context. So what this is arguing is that if I'm teaching in an ESL classroom with ELL children, I really have to be very careful about the choice of curriculum that I'm choosing to adopt, as well as the type of instruction. So the argument here is I might have children, do a role play where they're on the phone with each other and they're learning to order pizza. Now that is an example of a lesson that is context embedded. I'm giving them a context in which to perform the English language. However, it's not a very rigorous or cognitively demanding task. That activity would fall in this particular quadrant, cognitively undemanding, but also context embedded. If I had given students an article in Science News that deals with the evolution of human beings, all of a sudden now I'm in a very different quadrant. Now I have a cognitively demanding task for them to do, but also that might lack context. It's really hard for students to imagine human evolution over time. It's not something that they can relate to. So as a teacher, I want to make sure that I balance all of these kinds of quadrants, that there are moments and times in my teaching where I'm presenting activities and lessons that are cognitively demanding as well as cognitively undemanding. Lessons and activities that are context embedded as well as activities that are abstract and don't really have a context. But the truth of the matter today is that it's really, really imperative, especially the way that kids are being tested today on standardized tests, whether it's the PARCC test or your local state standardized test, for them to have an understanding of the cognitive academic language. So it doesn't matter for me to teach them, for example, I might teach them basic vocabulary that first year, words like table and chair and so on. But the argument here is that children will eventually pick up those conversational words, right? But it's much more hard, it's much more challenging for them to understand what is precipitation or evaporation or condensation. And those are the kinds of cognitively demanding words and terms that can only be taught at school, that they cannot pick up in conversation with their friends. And so therefore, all of a sudden you saw a shift in the way we were teaching ELL children, where now the focus is much more so on cognitively demanding activities, where you're building in scaffolding, where you're doing context embeddedness, you're helping them better understand that challenging text, but nonetheless you're holding up the students to a rigorous curriculum. You're not dumbing down the curriculum because they happen to not know English. This was a challenge for me throughout my teaching. There were times when I went to my principal and I said, I really want to teach this challenging course on solar energy with my ESL students. And sometimes the administrators would say, well, I don't think they can handle that. I don't think ELL children can really handle that cognitively demanding curriculum, and it's quite the opposite. They can handle it as long as you build in scaffolding and as long as you use strategies that are going to help them better understand that cognitively demanding task. However, what's worse is to dumb down the curriculum and give them a curriculum that's very low in terms of what they need to be able to master at that particular grade level. Thank you.